Hello, welcome everyone as you join us today. Welcome to our speaker series, the Neighbourhood Justice Centre and other community justice models. The NJC opened in 2007 and is Australia's first and only community justice centre and a world-first international mentor community court. The centre sits as part of a global network of over 80 community justice centres worldwide and sits within Specialist Courts and Programs Division of Magistrates Courts Victoria. Magistrate David Fanning here at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre was unable to attend today but did want to welcome our speaker. So I will now share my screen and a video of him welcoming Professor Murray today.
I regret not being present, even virtually, to welcome Dr. Murray here today as part of the speaker series. Dr. Murray is Professor of Law at the University of Western Australia and has a particular interest in community justice, having completed her PhD in the area, for which she was awarded the prestigious Molly Holman Award as the top PhD student for that year at the law school. This followed substantial success as a student, both in her undergraduate degree and in her master's degrees in law. Subsequently, she's been widely published in the area, and not surprisingly, she's been appointed a professor at a very young age. More importantly, perhaps, than just being a consummate academic, Professor Murray possesses that rare ability to be able to meaningfully and in a very real way draw the connection between academia and bring together relevance of that academia to the real world, if I can call it the real world, not being disparaging of academia. But it is a rare quality, and Sarah possesses it in spades. She's made an important contribution in Western Australia, I know from my own personal experience, in being able to advocate for and to further the development of a community justice centre in Western Australia. She continues to do that with energy, vitality, and with great persuasiveness. And I'm sure there'll be success in Western Australia when it is established, no doubt that it will be. Dr. Murray will be of great interest to you, not only, as I say, is because she's highly intelligent and very capable as an academic, but she's also well able to relate that academic learning to the real world. And I'm sure you'll find what she has to say interesting, stimulating, and you'll go away from this session uplifted by what she has to say. Thank you and welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Magistrate Fanning, and thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you to the NJC for giving me this opportunity to talk to you all today. I'd also just like to start by also acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Whadjuk Noongar land, and that acknowledge that the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation are the traditional owners and cultural custodians of the land on which I'm zooming from you today. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, I'm just going to be sharing my PowerPoints with you today, and hopefully you can all see those now. What I'd like to do in the time that we have today is I'd like to talk about some of the core elements of the Community Justice Centre model. And then I'm going to talk through a number of exemplars of that model worldwide, and then move to talk a little bit about the possibility of mainstreaming the model. And then I hope that we'll have some time for questions from you all. I can see that there's so many familiar faces here in the audience, and many people who have a great deal of knowledge of the Community Justice Centre model. So I'm sure that it'll give us a chance to have a really interesting discussion at the end of the talk. I think for me, one of the most profound things about community justice centres, both at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre and other centres worldwide, is that they fundamentally recalibrate the traditional model of justice in recognising that people's lives just aren't necessarily served or matched by courts' jurisdictions as traditionally conceived. And I think I learnt this, particularly sitting next to Judge Calabrese on the bench at Red Hook and talking about this very reality that people's lives are just messier than that. And to some degree, the law isn't always enough. It doesn't always take us where we need to go. And I really think, for me, that is the real potential of this model. And as much as we might start saying, well, what are the elements of community justice? What defines a community justice centre? I think it's very important that we don't think of the community justice centre model as a cookie cutter style model, that there's one approach, or it has to have particular elements to meet a community justice centre definition. Instead, I think it's helpful, though, to think about, well, what do centres share? What are some of the common themes that we see, while accepting that there's not a bright line around these in all cases? So what are some of those elements, and what are some of those themes that we tend to see? Well, I think solution-focused justice has to be up there as one of the really key elements that we see across these centres. And that is because their goal is to address the causes of criminality at the grassroots level, to really look at individuals holistically, look at communities holistically, to try and reduce recidivism, to really address social dislocation, to partner with the local community, and to co-locate a whole host of services with the courthouse, which really allow for that holistic approach to justice to really happen. And what the solution-focused approach allows is for you to see the opportunity of a court appearance as a chance to address some of the underlying issues that can entrap people within a cycle of offending, and really look to partner with them to begin to address some of those challenges. So it really is a unique approach. And I guess I draw very much on some of the writings of people like Ari Freiberg, in the idea of moving away from thinking about it as being problem solving to thinking about it being solution focused, because I think sometimes focusing on it just as problems doesn't really explain the true complexity of people's lives. And I just think solution focused is a better way of describing what it is that these centres can achieve. We also see a focus on community collaboration, and that's where we see the partnering with community, connecting with community, to really think about collaborative crime prevention, to think about connecting with all sorts of stakeholders across the community to make sure that the centre is meeting the community's needs and continues to do that. I mean, if anything that we've learnt in the last 15, 16 months or less now is really the importance of our justice system being flexible, and the need for our courts and our community justice centres to do the same. As Judge Calabrese was just saying before the session started, the case is that the Red Hook Community Justice Centre is still closed and operating online. That that the community justice model needs to be able to pivot. And I know we are probably all a bit tired of that word after the last year, but that's true. We need to be able to be dynamic and flexible with the way these centres operate. We also see this focus on co-design, where the community comes to own the centre and ensure that that centre is tailored to the needs of the community, as well as its historical, cultural, political context. Typically, you see centres with a one court, one judicial officer model, which allows that judicial officer to really know that local community and develop strong connections with that local community. We also see, and you'll have seen this if you've watched the video, which Alicia would have circulated on the NJC, that we see typically this wraparound joined up service model where we see a whole host of support services co-located. But importantly, I think when you visit these centres, the emphasis is on it very much being a centre housing a court and all of these services, rather than the other way around and seeing it as a court sitting alongside a centre. The focus is really on this being a community justice centre, and the court forms part of that, but it's very much more than just that. Also with the model, you see drawing on a number of approaches. Many of these will be familiar with you all. Principles like therapeutic jurisprudence, which is about the importance of thinking about how interactions with the legal system can benefit individual well-being. Principles like restorative justice, principles like procedural justice. Procedural justice is this idea of making sure that people appearing before a court feel empowered, they feel heard, they feel that their individual dignity has been respected by the court process, so that even if you don't necessarily like the result, you feel as though that you have had a respectful process which has really allowed you to tell your story. And I think that's also something we see as really something that can blossom within the Community Justice Centre model. So fundamentally, we think about it as a place-based justice solution, I think, and that's really something that across the different exemplars I'm going to talk about today is something that we see time and time again. I think it's important to recognise that for community justice centres, success is something that I think is really hard to define and often hard to demonstrate, not because centres don't succeed, but because success is so multifaceted, and success looks different to what success might look like in a standard court environment. And typically, the standard criminal justice indicators, things like recidivism, severity of offending, time between offending, it just doesn't really capture the richness of the community justice experience. It doesn't capture the depth of community engagement, the partnerships, the solution-focused wins, the crime prevention approaches which have been adopted. And it's sometimes really necessary to think outside the box in how centres talk about how they've succeeded and what they've achieved with this model, because it just does look so different. It really comes down to how do you explain and translate this holistic impact in a way that makes sense. And that's also complicated by the inevitable reality that there are a lot of variables at play. So it's not always easy to isolate these indicators. And I think this is something that we've really learnt from some of the community justice centres that have been in operation for a long time now, is ways of achieving this, ways of telling the stories of success from the community justice centres around the world. And I think the research really talks about the need to plan for this. You'll see here on the PowerPoint, I've got factors here which I think can aid success. And this really comes down to the planning of centres, comes down to the co-designing process and the partnering with the community very, very early on in that planning process, so that you can't just plonk a centre down and expect that it will have that community buy-in and ownership, that it really needs to be well thought out. There needs to be needs assessments. It might be that a community justice centre isn't the right thing for a particular community. Maybe readiness, the readiness for it isn't quite there. So it's really about looking at the location, it's looking at the needs of that area, it's looking at the services that are in that area, and really looking to ensure that that centre is going to meet the needs of the community and be suitably bespoke for that community. Now, many of you I know are very familiar with the NJC model. And I think it's really important, though, for us to reflect on, well, what stands out about the NJC? What is it that we learn from the experience of the Neighbourhood Justice Centre? And what I continually say to people in talking about the NJC and the Community Justice Centre model itself is that if you had never stepped inside a courtroom, you might not realise the uniqueness of this model. And I think that is just really hard to explain if you haven't experienced these centres. On my first visit to the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, I was met by a security guard offering me a hot chocolate. Now, I've been in courts for many years and I've never been offered a hot chocolate. And just when I was pulling myself off the floor, recovering from being offered a Milo, the security guard rocked up the big barrel of marshmallows and asked me if I wanted a pink or a white one. You know, I mean, these are not traditional experiences that we have in court environments. And I think that's really where the Community Justice Centre story begins, is fundamentally changing these experiences that we have in justice environments. When we look at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, it's no exception to that. And it's been one of the most intensively studied courts in Australia since its opening in 2007. And what we see from a lot of those studies into the operation of the court and from experiencing the court is the incredible connections it's established with the community in the city of Yarra, the relationships with stakeholders, the incredible work of the client services team and co-located agencies, which have allowed these partnerships to develop. We see, and you can see there in some of the photos I've got from the centre, is the uniqueness and design of the building has been fundamental to its success. In that, you know, it has a children's play area. It allows for community art to be displayed and changed regularly. And it has, you know, soccer awards being delivered in the foyer of the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. And these sorts of things mean that the community don't just see the NJC as a justice environment. This is a centre that forms part of the community. That's where I got my soccer award. You know, this is a centre that becomes and has become part of the fabric of the city of Yarra because it has such deeper meanings for those in the community. We have, and this is also touched on in the video that Alicia would have sent you earlier, is the incredible work of the program innovation team, which has really allowed for the centre to work prophylactically with the community, to identify hotspots in the community, to work on community safety, community education programs. And it's been fundamental in promoting the model and justice innovation. As the video talks about, it's become a bit of a living lab or a justice incubator for new ideas. And so, for example, we've seen coming out of the centre is the influence of innovations like this online family violence intervention application approach, where this has now been really influential in the family violence spaces and has been rolled out across Victoria, which has really allowed the NJC to really live its role as one of these international community courts, which allows for different innovations to be spread out. And we see that also with other innovations like the shift to online guilty pleas and looking at things like some of the developments of the alcohol and drug rehab app, which has also been developed by the NJC. So these are really, we really see the NJC operating so differently from other courts because of the uniqueness of its operation and because of the community development, the community partnerships it's established. I think one of the other things that really stands out about the NJC compared to a lot of other community justice centres is the departure from that sort of traditional kind of airport-like security screening, where the centre takes on a much more dynamic, court security approach, which really changes the feel of the centre so that people can come to the centre and use the centre even if they don't have a matter before the court and feel like it is a community justice centre, because it doesn't necessarily feel like a traditional justice environment because of the innovative ways that the centre's been able to think about some of these important aspects which need to be closed off. To talk about the Red Hook Community Justice Centre with Judge Calabresi here seems ridiculous, when really Judge Calabresi knows so much more about this centre, but it's an honour to have you here, Judge, and I'm sure we might have some questions in question time about the amazing work that you've done at Red Hook. And interestingly, we can't talk about community justice centres without talking about Red Hook. I mean, Red Hook has just celebrated its 20-year anniversary. And in those 20 years, the incredible impact that the Red Hook Community Justice Centre has had on Red Hook is really hard to begin to explain in the time that we have. But you can see all sorts of initiatives coming out of the centre over that time, things like the peacemaking program, the incredible connection that the centre was able to develop with the Red Hook community very, very early on through its co-design and planning, through the amazing work and partnership with the Public Safety Corps, which really allowed for Red Hook community members to really buy into the centre, to really help design the centre. And the centre has been tremendous at adapting to the needs of Red Hook over that time. And as I've said, they've had to do that to a great degree in the last 12 months with the challenges presented by COVID. Judge Calabresi has established incredibly strong community relationships with his time on the bench. The centre's also been so conscious of continually monitoring and getting feedback from the community about how it's working, you know, with focus groups and surveys of the community and court user assessments. And consistently what comes back is this sense that people appearing or coming to the Red Hook Community Justice Centre feel that they are treated like a person. And that is just so powerful, to feel that you are treated like a neighbour, you are treated like a person. And that is something that you experience the moment you enter the Red Hook Community Justice Centre. Like the NJC, you don't have to have a matter before Judge Calabresi or the court to use the services at the centre. And that's been, I think, is very significant to really allowing the centre to become an ensconced part of the community. There are so many models that we could talk about today and exemplars, and it's really hard to know where to start. Here I've just chosen 2 centres also from across New York, just to give you a flavour of the diversity of these models, but there are so many across the United States, some of which I will be talking about in a moment. On the right here, we have the Midtown Community Court, which was the first community justice centre as such to emerge. It emerged in the early 90s out of some of the challenges of the time presented by the Times Square precinct. And the Midtown Community Court then inspired so many other courts to innovate and to think differently. But what was really, I think, interesting about the Midtown Community Court and its early work was this really big focus on thinking about getting offenders to contribute positively to the community, to get offenders out there, you know, cleaning up graffiti and picking up rubbish, and to really feel as though that they can do good to the community. The community can see that the community can be improved and that things are not always going to remain in this broken windows pattern. The Harlem Community Justice Centre, as you can see there in that photo, is a really good example, I think, of sort of the bespoke crafting of programs depending on the needs of the community. In Harlem, we see a real focus on housing, real focus on thinking about people who might be facing eviction or tenancy issues and how the centre can work with those individuals. It has a focus on men's empowerment. It has a focus on youth programs because of the needs of the Harlem community. And that's the centre has continually evolved as those needs have developed. I want to talk about the Brownsville Community Justice Centre. Now, the Brownsville Community Justice Centre is not that far from Red Hook. I mean, it's east Brooklyn, really. But I think the Brownsville Community Justice Centre represents such a unique prototype of this Community Justice Centre model that we can't not talk about it. The reason Brownsville is so significant is because it's departed from one of those core elements that I focused on in the very beginning, and that is on the co-location of a court. When the Brownsville Community Justice Centre was being planned, it was very much based on the Red Hook Community Justice Centre model, and a lot of the individuals who'd been part of the development of Red Hook were involved with Brownsville. But what happened was that the court that was planned for Brownsville didn't get the approvals that initially were thought would be achieved. And the plan then was to proceed with the Brownsville Community Justice Centre without a co-located court. And I think this is what makes the Brownsville Community Justice Centre so fascinating, because what this allowed the Brownsville Community Justice Centre to do was to really think what a potential community justice centre could achieve in Brownsville. And the team under James Broddick and others have just done the most amazing things, because one of the challenges in Brownsville was that there was a real need to take the community with the planners of this centre, because of the concern of Brownsville residents that developing a community justice centre may have a risk of actually changing Brownsville so that it was no longer theirs. This idea that maybe Brownsville wouldn't be the same anymore, and where would we fit in this new Brownsville? And what the planners really did was take that to heart, take the community with them on that journey, and that has really influenced everything about the way Brownsville has operated since those early days. In that, you can see here some photos from some of the programs that have been led by the Justice Centre. As part of here, this is the Belmont Revitalisation Project, which has really said, look, let's look at the Brownsville community and let's partner with the community to think about what we can do to transform Brownsville. And this has involved, community murals. It's involved creating public meeting spaces. It's involved working on lighting. On the top left here, you can see a shipping container. And this was something that the young people were keen to use to create a youth space that could belong to them, that they could design and use, and it could be theirs. And this is something that Brownsville has really done incredibly well. They've established employment programs that get locals working in the local cafes. They've got a learning lab which allows for projects and businesses and innovation and upskilling of Brownsville residents. There was also a really fascinating program where a social housing building was seen to really lack spaces for the kids to play and sort of public spaces. And the young people actually partnered with the architects who designed the social housing building to sort of retrofit spaces for kids to play and to be together. But this was something that, again, they owned and that they had helped design, which has really made it such a success. The centre still has a number of programs which link with justice-involved individuals. So, it has, parole and young offenders programs, it has youth court programs and diversionary programs, but it doesn't have the court at its heart, which I think for Brownsville has really allowed it to think quite differently about what the centre can achieve without a court. And this, I think, has been quite important for a community which has had some quite difficult experiences with the justice system in the past, and really allowed for that centre to do some quite powerful things in that space. Now, there are so many other exemplars that I could talk about, and I didn't really know where to start, and hopefully we might have some time in question time if there are other models that you'd like to ask about. But I wanted to talk about the library court models because I found these particularly fascinating. The first such model comes out of the Spokane Community Court in East Washington. And what this developed out of was a real need to think about defendants, particularly who are facing issues of homelessness, and there was a real tendency for a lot of people to miss court appearances, and there were a lot of issues around some of the supports that weren't being met for these particular defendants. It turned out from a needs assessment that a lot of these defendants were already accessing the local library and that a lot of supports were provided by that library. And this developed into a very innovative model where the Spokane Library then turned into hosting a community court one day a week, which allowed for a whole host of services to then come on that day and be there for defendants appearing before that court. So this included, mental health services, volunteers assisting with paperwork, they were giving out bus passes, help with finding permanent housing. And it really saw the library space redesigned to cater for the need for a degree of security. Also, the fact that a lot of the defendants would come with a lot of baggage and the need to store that safely while they were appearing before the court. And really, this was a space that was seen as a safe environment, and that really did increase attendance by defendants. And the library saw this as really a continuance of its service of the community. And this has been echoed in Oregon and Nevada, where we've seen other libraries following a similar model. Israel has seen a number of community justice initiatives coming out of some of the magistrates' courts in Beersheba, Ramleh, and Tel Aviv. And these community courts have taken quite a focused approach to community justice, which have seen a co-location of a small team that really can target a particular suite of offences, particularly where people are facing a term of imprisonment, and can then partner that with supports as well as some of those community programs like social soccer, community gardens, and employment assistance, which has really seen a combination of volunteers, stakeholders, and some of those more traditional services partnering alongside these court models. Canada, I'm conscious of running out of time, so I won't go into too much detail with Canada, but certainly Vancouver has had the downtown community court operating for some time. Ontario is embarking on a range of new community justice centre initiatives with different focuses from youth to sort of a bicultural community justice centre in Kenora and others. And this has been sort of part of an extensive co-design process with those communities. And we saw last year the Inverness Justice Centre opened in Scotland, which has seen a host of justice services co-located and a real embrace of sort of a problem-solving approach, but is really building on a focus in Scotland on trying to develop sort of coordinated service delivery across the justice space and across government. And so it's fitting within that broad approach to delivering services. I'm particularly interested in the idea of mainstreaming community justice, and I think it's important for us to talk about what this might look like and what it can't look like. I think, what are the benefits of mainstreaming? Well, certainly the obvious benefit is to broaden access to community justice initiatives, to give judges more tools in their toolbox, to allow them to serve a wider a number of people across the community. But obviously that comes with the real challenge, doesn't it? And that is, how do you retain the community connection at the mainstream level? And what has to change to allow that to happen in the mainstream? I think some of the challenges here really are focused on how you continue to serve the needs of the community and the differences between and within communities. So particularly, I think, in relation to First Nations communities, how do you make sure that you can meet the needs of that community if you're operating in a centralised location, you're potentially quite remote from some of the communities that you're serving, and the need to maintain a clear community engagement strategy. But I think it's really important that we explore how this can occur because of the benefits that can emerge from community justice initiatives. So the two examples that I think are helpful to talk about here are a model that was trialled in Washington, the Washington DC model, where what we saw in Washington was this sort of police district method, where you had a central court in Washington DC have a number of judges, with each judge in that central court allocated a particular district so that they could hear matters coming out of that district. The judge, although centrally located, developed community connections with that relevant district, would attend meetings in that district, got to know the services and the community in that district, so that it could start creating relationships with that district, even within a centralised model. And interestingly, when this was embarked upon by Judge Kanan, it was done on the basis of no extra budget being allocated. So they were trying to do it in a very low-cost way or no-cost way to try and trial something different. So we see there a way of trying to retain community connection through a centralised model. The Hartford Community Court, I think, is also an interesting model because we see a court effectively servicing about 17 localities, retaining community referrals, having community service done at the local level, and also having sort of a hotline approach where people can call up the community court with, community justice centre projects, and people can kind of try and keep that local connection. We also see a number of initiatives where you have mainstream courts working along with joined up services, and you see that across in Australia, you see that across the US. And so I guess there's a real need to think about how can some of the benefits of community justice be brought into the mainstream, and what changes do we have to make to allow that to happen. I think the key thing to take from this today is this idea that the community justice centre model is just a starting point. These centres are far from homogenous, and this is just likely to continue as the model continues to spread. It doesn't mean that every centre needs to look alike. I mean, certainly, the Red Hook Community Justice Centre was very influential on the development of the Neighbourhood Justice Centre after the Attorney General visited the model, but the Neighbourhood Justice Centre has many ways that it's different, and that is exactly the way the model is designed to work, so that it can be a local place-based justice solution. I think, as Greg Berman says, that there's no magic recipe for creating a community court. He says that jurisdictions will inevitably have to improvise to respond to the unique conditions on the ground. And that is exactly what we see from this kind of whistle-stop tour of some of these community justice centres that I've talked about today.